The same hands that painted the Sistine Chapel designed machines to destroy human bodies. Florence, 1598. While Michelangelo carved marble into divine perfection just blocks away, a woman named Caterina is dragged beneath the Palazzo Vecchio into chambers tourists walk over today, without knowing what lies below. The crowd outside celebrates. They think they're witnessing justice. What they're actually witnessing is the dark genius of an age that turned punishment into both art and science. The Renaissance gave us Leonardo's flying machines and Galileo's telescope. It gave us perspective in painting and the printing press. But it also gave us innovations in human suffering that would make medieval torturers look like amateurs. Because when the same brilliant minds that revolutionized art and science turned their attention to punishment, they created devices of such calculated cruelty that even writing about them was sometimes forbidden. Listen closely. That sound you hear isn't just stones settling in ancient buildings. In Prague, in London, in Rome, beneath palaces and courthouses across Europe, chambers still exist where Renaissance creativity showed its darkest face. The iron devices are gone, moved to museums where we look at them behind glass, unable to comprehend that the same culture that produced the Mona Lisa's smile also produced machines designed to remove smiles permanently. Here's what they never taught you in art history class. The Renaissance wasn't just a rebirth of classical learning. It was an explosion of innovation that touched everything, including the systematic destruction of human bodies. Have you heard of the device that could compress a person until their bones fused together? Or the invention that Renaissance engineers proudly demonstrated to nobles, showing how it could fold a human body into impossible positions without quite killing them? What about the iron masks that weren't just restraints but portable prisons for the face, some decorated with such artistic detail that they're now displayed in museums as examples of Renaissance metalwork? The craftsmen who made them signed their work, proud of creating instruments that would silence human voices forever. Consider this. Lorenzo de' Medici, the great patron of Renaissance art, personally owned a collection of punishment devices that he displayed alongside classical sculptures in his palazzo. He saw no contradiction between collecting beauty and collecting instruments of suffering. To the Renaissance mind, both represented human achievement, the mastery of form, whether in marble or flesh. And then there's the punishment that was considered so effective at destroying both body and soul that it was reserved for the worst crimes imaginable. Victims didn't just die. They were methodically erased, piece by piece, in public ceremonies that could last for days. Even hardened soldiers who had seen battle would turn away from these spectacles. The Renaissance didn't invent cruelty. Humans have always found ways to hurt each other. But the Renaissance perfected it, systematized it, turned it into a science with principles and methods, and carefully documented results. They created instruction manuals, trained specialists, established protocols. They transformed punishment from passionate vengeance into calculated procedure. Between 1450 and 1650, Europe experienced an unprecedented explosion of innovation in punishment technology. Over 300 distinct devices were invented or significantly improved. Guilds of executioners held conferences to share techniques. Universities included punishment theory in their legal curricula. This wasn't hidden or shameful. It was considered essential to maintaining civilized order. 8 innovations in horror await us, each representing a different aspect of Renaissance ingenuity applied to human suffering. From devices that attacked the body from within, to methods that destroyed identity itself. These weren't random acts of violence, but carefully designed instruments that reflect the Renaissance obsession with understanding and controlling every aspect of human existence, including how to end it most effectively. What makes these punishments truly horrifying isn't just the physical pain they caused, it's the intellectual brilliance behind them. The same mathematical principles that created perfect domes were applied to calculating exactly how much pressure a human body could withstand. The same understanding of anatomy that produced masterful sculptures was used to identify the most sensitive points for maximum suffering. The workshops that produced these devices operated alongside those creating art and scientific instruments. In Nuremberg, the same metalworking district that produced astrolabes and clocks also manufactured execution equipment. The craftsmen moved between projects without distinction, applying identical standards of precision, whether creating a timepiece or a torture device. Prepare yourself. We're about to explore what happened when history's greatest explosion of human creativity was aimed at human destruction. In 1534, Sir Leonard Skeffington had a problem. As Lieutenant of the Tower of London under Henry VIII, he needed new ways to extract confessions from political prisoners. The rack was effective, but old-fashioned. What England needed was innovation. So Skeffington, an educated man who understood principles of physics and anatomy, invented something unprecedented. He called it the scavenger's daughter, though history would remember it as Skeffington's gyves. Where the rack pulled bodies apart, this device did the opposite. It compressed them into a space smaller than nature ever intended. The mechanism was elegantly simple, which was part of its horror. An iron hoop that closed around the victim, forcing their knees against their chest against thighs, head pushed down between their knees. Imagine being folded like a letter, but your body isn't paper. The compression happened gradually, controlled by screws that could be tightened incrementally. Each turn reduced the space your body occupied by another fraction. The engineering blueprints for Skeffington's original device still exist in the Tower of London archives. They reveal mathematical calculations for optimal compression ratios, stress distribution patterns, and material specifications that would make modern engineers appreciate the sophistication involved. The device used compound leverage principles that wouldn't be formally described in physics texts for another century. What Skeffington understood, what made him a Renaissance innovator rather than a medieval brute, was pressure dynamics. He calculated exactly how much compression would cause maximum distress without immediate death. Too much pressure, too quickly, and the victim would lose consciousness. Too little, and they could endure. But find the perfect balance, and you created a situation where the body's own systems became the torture. The tower's expense records from 1535 show payments to 3 different metalworkers for components of the device. John Smythe received 12 shillings for iron bands of specified thickness. Thomas Hartwell was paid 8 shillings for precision screws and threading. William Cooper earned 15 shillings for assembly and testing of the complete mechanism. This wasn't improvised brutality, but commissioned engineering. The physiological effects were precisely documented by tower officials, because the Renaissance documented everything. After 30 minutes, blood vessels in the nose and ears would rupture from pressure. After an hour, victims reported feeling like their ribs were crushing their lungs, though examination showed the ribs remained intact. It was the compression of space, not breaking of bones, that created the sensation. Dr. John Picton, the tower's physician from 1540 to 1555, left detailed medical notes about the device's effects. He observed that victims experienced what he called interior drowning, where compressed lungs couldn't expand properly, creating the sensation of suffocating while still technically able to breathe. His notebooks, discovered in the British Library in 1972, provide clinical descriptions that read like medical research conducted through judicial torture. Catholic priests during Elizabeth I's reign were frequently subjected to the scavenger's daughter. Father John Gerard, who survived and wrote about his experience, described it as being buried alive in iron. He noted that the worst part wasn't the compression itself, but the gradual nature of it. Knowing that each minute brought slightly more pressure, that relief was entirely in the hands of his interrogators. Gerard's account, smuggled out of England and published in Rome in 1605, provides minute-by-minute description of 3 hours in the device. He writes of hallucinations caused by restricted blood flow, of joints that felt like they were dissolving, of a sensation he could only describe as becoming smaller than God intended any man to be. His survival was considered miraculous. Most victims confessed within the first hour. The device was stored in the tower of London's Lower Wakefield Tower, in a room specifically modified to accommodate it. The floor was reinforced to handle the device's weight and the stress of its operation. Hooks were installed in the walls to secure the device during use. Iron rings in the floor allowed guards to chain other prisoners where they would be forced to watch the compression, a psychological preparation for their own interrogation. Between 1534 and 1605, Tower records indicate the scavenger's daughter was used at least 120 times. The survival rate was surprisingly high, around 80%, which made it valuable for interrogation rather than execution. But survival didn't mean recovery. Many victims suffered permanent spinal compression, reduced lung capacity, and chronic pain that lasted their remaining years. The psychological impact was equally calculated. Unlike the rack, which attacked the body's extremities and worked inward, the scavenger's daughter attacked the core and compressed outward. Victims described feeling like they were imploding, like their essential self was being condensed into nothing. This existential horror often proved more effective than physical pain in securing confessions. Records show that merely showing the device to prisoners increased confession rates by 40%. A letter from the Tower's constable to the Privy Council in 1578 notes that the mere presence of Skeffington's engine in the chamber oft produces such terror that further persuasion becomes unnecessary. The device's reputation became its primary function. What made this particularly Renaissance was the intersection of engineering and psychology. Skeffington didn't just build a device that hurt. He built one that demonstrated human powerlessness against mechanical precision. The victim couldn't fight back, couldn't resist, could only endure while machinery slowly redefined the space their body was allowed to occupy. The device spawned imitators across Europe. In 1545, a German engineer named Hans Gruber created a similar device he called the Embracing Maiden. French interrogators developed le pressoir, the wine press, operating on similar principles. Each variation reflected local engineering traditions while maintaining the core concept of controlled compression. The last recorded use was in 1605 against suspects in the gunpowder plot. By then, the device had become legendary, its mere presence in the tower enough to secure confessions before it was even employed. The psychological impact of knowing such calculated compression existed often proved as effective as actual use. Today, replica devices exist in museums, but they can't convey the Renaissance mindset that created them. This was an age that believed human reason could solve any problem, including the problem of how to make people confess without leaving marks that would complicate public trials. The scavenger's daughter left victims broken internally while appearing intact externally, a perfect solution for an age obsessed with appearances. If England perfected the art of crushing life inward, making bodies smaller than nature intended, the continent was developing methods that went in the opposite direction entirely. Renaissance Europe inherited many punishments from the medieval period, but it refined them with disturbing scientific precision. The sawing punishment exemplified this evolution, transforming a crude execution into a calculated spectacle that demonstrated both anatomical knowledge and theatrical sophistication. The method appeared across the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and parts of Italy throughout the 1500s. But this wasn't random brutality. Renaissance authorities had studied Roman law, which prescribed specific punishments for specific crimes. Sawing was reserved for particular offenses, military desertion, religious heresy, and crimes that symbolically divided the community. In Augsburg's city archives, a document from 1552 details the commissioning of specialized saws from the Metalworkers Guild. The specifications required blades of Swedish steel, teeth set at specific angles for optimal cutting through bone and sinew, handles weighted for proper balance during extended use. The same guild that produced precision instruments for Renaissance surgeons was creating tools for methodical human division. The positioning was crucial and carefully planned. Victims were suspended, inverted, secured by the ankles. Renaissance anatomists understood that this position would maintain blood flow to the brain, preventing the quick unconsciousness that might come from blood loss. They had literally engineered a method to extend awareness. Gaspar Torella, physician to Pope Alexander VI, wrote in his medical treatise of 1505 about observing such executions. He noted with clinical detachment how inversion affected blood pressure, how consciousness persisted despite massive trauma, how the body's own circulatory system became complicit in prolonging suffering. His observations, intended for medical education, reveal how punishment served as anatomical instruction. In 1561, the Spanish Inquisition used this method against 3 men accused of spreading Protestant texts in Seville. The execution took place in the Plaza de San Francisco, with medical professionals present to document the proceedings. This wasn't just punishment. It was a study in human endurance that contributed to Renaissance understanding of anatomy and consciousness. The event was recorded by Francisco Peña in his Directorium Inquisitorum, where he describes not just the method, but the careful preparation. The platform was constructed at a specific height to ensure visibility. Musicians played drums to announce the beginning. Priests recited prayers at measured intervals. The executioner wore ceremonial dress that distinguished him from common laborers. Every element was choreographed to transform execution into sacrament. The tools themselves became specialized. Renaissance craftsmen created saws specifically for these executions, with teeth designed to cut through flesh and bone at a controlled rate. Too sharp, and death came quickly. Too dull, and the executioner exhausted himself. The balance required expertise that executioners passed down through apprenticeships. In Venice, the Council of Ten commissioned a study in 1543 to determine the optimal blade thickness for judicial sawing. They consulted metallurgists, anatomists, and experienced executioners. The resulting specifications were classified as state secrets, demonstrating how seriously Renaissance governments took the technology of punishment. The perfect blade was considered as valuable as military intelligence. What distinguished Renaissance application from medieval was the theatrical element. Scaffolds were constructed with specific sightlines in mind. The height was calculated so the maximum number of spectators could witness the punishment. Some cities built permanent structures, architectural features that reminded citizens daily of justice's reach. The architect Sebastiano Serlio included scaffold designs in his architectural treatises, treating execution platforms as legitimate architectural challenges, requiring the same mathematical precision as churches or palaces. His designs included calculations for crowd capacity, structural load-bearing during struggles, drainage systems for fluids, and acoustic considerations to ensure dying words could be heard by officials. German cities particularly embraced the symbolic aspects. In Nuremberg, the punishment was performed at crossroads, literally dividing the criminal at a divided path. The body parts would then be displayed at different city gates, a geographic distribution of justice that required careful planning and coordination. The Nuremberg City Council's minutes from 1573 detail the logistics. For the execution of Hans Müller, condemned for desertion, 4 guards for transport of quarters to designated gates, 2 scribes to record the distribution, 1 herald to announce the display at each location, preservation salt for summer displays, and construction of appropriate mounting posts. The bureaucracy of dismemberment required as much planning as any civic festival. The medical observations from these executions contributed to Renaissance anatomical knowledge. Physicians noted how long consciousness persisted, which organs' failure caused death, how the body responded to trauma. This knowledge, gained through judicial punishment, found its way into medical texts that advanced surgical understanding. Andreas Vesalius, the father of modern anatomy, admitted in private correspondence that observations from judicial sawing corrected several misconceptions in Galen's ancient texts. The revelation that certain blood vessels behaved differently under extreme trauma than in normal dissection led to improved surgical techniques that saved lives during battlefield amputations. By the late 1500s, the punishment had become rare, not from humanitarian concerns, but practical ones. The spectacle had become too disturbing for increasingly sophisticated urban populations. Renaissance cities were trying to attract merchants and artists. Public sawing conflicted with the image of cultured civilization they wished to project. The Venetian ambassador to the imperial court wrote in 1592, "The German practice of dividing criminals with saws may serve justice, but it repels the refined sensibilities necessary for commerce and diplomacy. A state that would be respected in the community of nations must find less visceral means of punishment." The last documented case in Western Europe occurred in 1581 in Bavaria, after which most regions formally abolished the practice. But the detailed documentation, the careful recording of methods and results, remained in legal archives, a testament to the Renaissance compulsion to systematize even the most extreme punishments. But not all Renaissance punishments attacked the body directly. Some targeted dignity and identity, creating portable prisons that victims carried on their own faces. In 1567, a Scottish woman named Bessie Taillefer was sentenced to something worse than death. For the crime of persistent scolding and blasphemous speech, she would wear the branks, an iron cage that enclosed her head and invaded her mouth, for 6 months. She survived, but court records note she never spoke above a whisper again. The branks, also called the scold's bridle, represented Renaissance innovation in social control. Rather than simply punishing the body, it attacked the very ability to communicate, to express identity through speech. The device emerged simultaneously across Scotland, England, and German states in the early 1500s, suggesting a shared cultural moment when controlling speech became paramount. The Edinburgh Council records from 1543 show the first official commissioning of branks. The order specifies 4 bridles of iron for the correction of scolding women, to be fashioned by Robert Blacketer, smith, with consideration for different sizes of head and severity of tongue. The municipal government approached this as a practical problem requiring technical solutions. Each brank was custom-made, requiring skilled metalwork that only Renaissance craftsmen could provide. The basic structure enclosed the head, but the crucial component was the gag piece, a metal plate or spike that pressed down on the tongue. Some versions had single spikes, others had multiple points. Some had rough plates designed to scrape the tongue if the wearer attempted speech. The workshop of Heinrich Kellner in Augsburg became renowned for producing high-quality branks. His account books, preserved in the city archives, show orders from 23 different cities between 1550 and 1570. He offered various models, the standard with single tongue plate, the deluxe with adjustable pressure mechanisms, and the ceremonial with decorative elements that indicated specific crimes. The decoration of these devices revealed Renaissance aesthetics applied to punishment. Many branks weren't plain iron, but elaborately designed with symbolic elements. Some featured pig snouts or donkey ears, transforming the wearer into a beast. Others had bells that rang with every movement, announcing the approach of the punished. The craftsmanship was often exquisite, with detailed metalwork that museums now display as art. In Perth, Scotland, the Kirk Session records from 1589 describe commissioning a special brank for Margaret Dawson, accused of notorious scolding and discord-making. The device featured a 2-inch iron tongue plate inscribed with biblical verses about the dangers of unbridled speech. The inscription required skilled engraving, transforming punishment into a display of metalworking artistry. Edinburgh's Kirk Sessions ordered branks for women who disturbed divine service or spoke against their husbands. But the definition of crimes expanded rapidly. By 1590, women could be sentenced to branks for gossiping, for laughing too loudly, for expressing opinions on theology. The device became a tool for enforcing not just law, but social conformity. The public nature of the punishment was essential. Women wearing branks were led through streets on market days, displayed at crossroads, sometimes chained to pillory posts where passers-by were encouraged to mock them. The inability to respond, to defend themselves verbally, was part of the punishment's psychological genius. A French visitor to Scotland in 1596 wrote, "I witnessed a woman bridled with iron, led through Edinburgh's streets while citizens threw refuse and shouted accusations she could not answer. The device had transformed her from person to object, from speaker to spectacle. The crowd's cruelty increased in proportion to her inability to respond." Records from Perth show that between 1540 and 1600, over 300 women were sentenced to wear branks. The duration varied from hours to months. Some women wore them only during daylight, allowed relief at night. Others were locked in continuously, fed thin gruel through tubes, unable to speak or eat normally for weeks. The physical effects were documented by town physicians. Extended wearing caused permanent jaw damage, dental problems from constant pressure, scarring of the tongue and palate. But the psychological damage was considered more severe. Women who had worn branks often remained voluntarily silent for years afterward, trained into voicelessness by iron conditioning. The branks spread beyond Britain to continental Europe, where they evolved into even more elaborate forms. German states produced branks with internal mechanisms that could be adjusted to increase pressure gradually. French versions included attachments for weights that would pull the head forward, creating constant neck strain. In Quedlinburg, a German craftsman named Matthias Zimmermann patented a brank design in 1578 that included a mechanism for introducing irritating substances onto the tongue plate, salt, vinegar, or pepper compounds that would cause additional discomfort without permanent damage. His patent application, preserved in guild records, describes this as an improvement in corrective efficiency. What made the branks particularly Renaissance was their precision targeting. Medieval punishments were often broadly violent. The branks specifically attacked speech, the human capacity that Renaissance philosophers considered most divine. By caging the tongue, authorities demonstrated control over what separated humans from animals. The philosophical implications weren't lost on Renaissance thinkers. Michel de Montaigne wrote in his essays about witnessing a woman wearing branks in Bordeaux, "What tyranny exceeds that which imprisons the tongue? They have caged not just flesh, but thought itself. For what is human thought without expression but a bird beating against bars?" The branks also reflected Renaissance gender anxieties. As women gained literacy and economic power in growing merchant cities, their voices became more threatening to traditional hierarchies. The branks literally silenced female speech that challenged male authority, transforming verbal power into criminal behavior, requiring mechanical suppression. The psychological impact extended far beyond the wearing. Women who had worn branks often remained silent for years afterward, trained into voicelessness. Communities learned that female speech itself was dangerous, subject to mechanical suppression. The branks didn't just punish individuals, they shaped entire cultures of silence. By 1650, most regions had officially abandoned the branks, though some Scottish communities used them into the 1700s. Today, over 60 surviving examples exist in museums, their iron faces still configured in grotesque expressions, eternal monuments to the Renaissance belief that speech itself could be criminalized. And yet, when external restraint wasn't enough, Renaissance engineers developed devices that attacked from within, turning the body's own spaces against it. The Renaissance obsession with mechanical precision produced many devices, but few combined engineering elegance with symbolic cruelty as effectively as the pair of anguish. First appearing in inventories from 1500s France and Germany, this palm-sized device represented the era's ability to transform simple mechanics into instruments of extraordinary control. The device resembled its namesake fruit when closed, with 4 metal segments forming a pear shape. A screw mechanism at the top, when turned, would force these segments apart. The innovation wasn't the expansion itself, but the precise control it offered. Each turn of the screw could be measured, documented, creating reproducible results that appealed to Renaissance systematic thinking. The earliest known technical drawing appears in a manuscript from Lyon dated 1512, showing detailed specifications. The segments must be of equal weight to ensure uniform expansion. The screw thread should advance 1/8 inch per complete revolution. Spring tension must resist closure with 15 pounds of force. This wasn't improvised cruelty, but engineered precision. Different versions served different purposes, each carefully designed for specific applications. The oral version was the most common, used primarily on those accused of heretical speech or blasphemy. The symbolism was deliberate. The fruit of forbidden knowledge, forcing open the mouth that had spoken forbidden words. The Parisian Guild of Metalworkers included pear construction in their masterwork requirements by 1540. Apprentices had to demonstrate ability to create functioning mechanisms with tolerances of less than 1 millimeter. The same standards applied whether creating clockwork or confession devices. This standardization reveals how normalized such devices had become in Renaissance manufacturing. In 1572, a Venetian craftsman named Antonio Moro was prosecuted for creating and selling these devices without proper authorization. His trial records provide rare insight into their construction. Moro described using specific metal alloys that wouldn't corrode, springs calibrated to provide exact resistance, and screws threaded to allow minute adjustments. This wasn't crude torture equipment, but precision engineering. Moro's workshop inventory, seized by authorities, included 17 pairs in various stages of completion. His notes described different models for different markets, basic versions for small towns, elaborate versions for major cities, and specialized versions for specific types of interrogation. He treated this as any other manufacturing business, with supply chains, quality control, and customer service. The French referred to it as le poids d'un joie, documenting its use in several high-profile cases. In 1584, a woman accused of witchcraft in Toulouse was subjected to the device during interrogation. The court recorder noted that the interrogators could achieve precise degrees of expansion, suggesting a standardized protocol had developed. The Toulouse archives contain the interrogation manual used, which specifies: begin with 3/4 turn to demonstrate mechanism. Advance by quarter turns at 5-minute intervals. Document resistance at each stage. Maximum expansion not to exceed 12 turns without medical consultation. This systematic approach transformed torture into bureaucratic procedure. What distinguished the Renaissance application was the medical supervision often present. Physicians would monitor the procedure, not from compassion, but to ensure maximum effectiveness without premature death. They documented physiological responses, creating what amounted to scientific studies of human endurance under precisely controlled conditions. Dr. Jacques Fontaine, royal physician at the French court, wrote in his private journal about observing pair interrogations. The device permits exact measurement of applied force. We can observe tissue response to mechanical expansion, document the threshold between discomfort and damage, chart the relationship between physical distress and psychological compliance. His clinical tone reveals how medical knowledge advanced through judicial torture. The psychological component was equally calculated. The device would often be shown to prisoners before use, sometimes demonstrated on fruit or leather to show its mechanism. The anticipation, the knowledge of exactly what would happen, became part of the punishment. Renaissance authorities understood that fear could be as effective as pain. A letter from the imperial interrogator in Prague, dated 1591, advises colleagues, "Allow the subject to handle the closed device, to feel its weight, to turn the screw themselves. This investment creates anticipation that amplifies eventual application. The mind completes what the mechanism begins." German museums house several examples, including one from Nuremberg with measurement marks etched into the screw, allowing operators to record exact settings. This quantification of suffering, the reduction of human agony to numerical values, exemplified Renaissance attempts to rationalize even irrational cruelty. The Nuremberg device includes a small notebook found with it, containing entries like Subject 47, 7 turns produced confession to minor heresy. Subject 48, required 11 turns, unusual resistance, recommend alternative methods. The bureaucratic tone transforms human suffering into data points. The device's use declined by the early 1600s, not from humanitarian evolution but practical considerations. The Renaissance was developing more efficient methods of interrogation that relied on psychological rather than physical pressure. The pear of anguish, despite its mechanical sophistication, belonged to an older paradigm of punishment. Modern historians debate how frequently these devices were actually used, versus their value as threats. The Renaissance understanding of deterrence was sophisticated enough to recognize that sometimes the fear of an instrument was more valuable than its application. The pear of anguish might have spent more time on display than in use, a visible reminder of authorities' reach into the body's most private spaces. But while some devices attacked individuals in private chambers, others transformed punishment into public spectacle, turning execution into community events that could last for days. No punishment better exemplified the Renaissance fusion of engineering, theatricality, and systematic cruelty than the breaking wheel. Known as the Catherine Wheel, after Saint Catherine of Alexandria, this method transformed execution into a carefully choreographed performance that could extend across multiple days. The wheel itself was a masterwork of Renaissance engineering. Typically 8 feet in diameter, constructed from oak reinforced with iron bands, it featured precisely spaced gaps where limbs would be threaded through. The construction required skilled wheelwrights who understood weight distribution and structural integrity. A poorly made wheel might collapse during use, turning solemn justice into farce. Master wheelwright Johannes Steinberg of Cologne left detailed specifications in his guild book of 1562. The wheel must bear 200 weight without flexing. Spokes should be oak-aged minimum 5 years. Iron reinforcement at stress points using Swedish steel. Balance must allow single-handed rotation when mounted vertically. These weren't improvised devices, but precision, engineered platforms for calculated destruction. In 1589, Germany witnessed one of the most documented uses of the wheel. Peter Stump, accused of werewolf attacks near Cologne, faced this punishment before thousands of spectators. The event was so significant that pamphlets describing it were printed and distributed across Europe, complete with woodcut illustrations that still survive in museums today. The pamphlet, titled "The Damnable Life and Deserved Death of Stubby Peter," went through multiple printings. It described not just the execution, but the entire theatrical production surrounding it. The construction of viewing platforms, the processional route, the symbolic elements incorporated into the punishment, and the moral lessons drawn by attending clergy. The process followed exact protocols developed over generations. First, the condemned was tied to the wheel, with limbs extended through the spokes. Then, using an iron bar or hammer, the executioner would break the bones methodically. Not randomly, but following a prescribed sequence that Renaissance anatomists had determined would maximize survival time while ensuring eventual death. The Frankfurt Executioner's Manual of 1573 specifies the order: begin with the shin bones, Proceed to the thighs, then the forearms, then the upper arms. The spine and skull remain intact until life persists beyond expected duration. This sequence was based on medical understanding of shock progression and consciousness maintenance. What made this particularly Renaissance was the mathematical precision involved. Executioners trained for years to learn exactly where to strike, with what force, at what angle. They understood that breaking the tibia required different force than the femur, that certain sequences of breaks would cause shock, while others wouldn't. This wasn't brutality, it was applied science. Master executioner Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg kept a diary from 1573 to 1618, documenting 361 executions he performed. His entries include precise details: broke Georg Prawn on the wheel, 11 blows required, survived 2 hours and 14 minutes, weather clear, crowd approximately 800. His meticulous records transformed execution into data. The public nature was essential to its purpose. Scaffolds were erected in central squares, high enough for visibility, but not so high that spectators couldn't see details. Vendors sold food and drinks. Musicians sometimes played between the breaking of different limbs. The execution became a social event that reinforced community bonds through shared witnessing. City records from Augsburg show expenses for a wheel execution in 1591. Lumber for scaffold, 12 gulden. Payment to executioner, 8 gulden. Guards for crowd control, 6 gulden. Musicians for processional, 4 gulden. Printing of moral pamphlets, 10 gulden. Refreshments for officials, 5 gulden. The execution was a civic investment requiring substantial planning and resources. French applications added theatrical elements. The condemned might be dressed in symbolic clothing representing their crimes. Military deserters wore their uniforms inside out. Heretics had religious symbols pinned to their clothes. The wheel itself might be decorated with paintings depicting the crimes, turning the instrument into a narrative device. The artist Jacques Callot created a series of etchings called The Miseries of War that included detailed depictions of wheel executions. His works show not just the punishment, but the entire social ecosystem surrounding it. Vendors selling souvenirs, artists sketching the scene, families positioning children for optimal viewing, clergy providing running commentary on the moral implications. The display after death was equally important. The broken body, woven through the wheel's spokes in impossible configurations, would be hoisted high on a pole. It might remain for weeks or months, a vertical monument to justice that birds would gradually disassemble. The location was chosen carefully, often at crossroads or city boundaries, creating geographic markers of authority. Medical professionals attended these executions, not to provide mercy but to document the process. Their observations contributed to Renaissance understanding of anatomy, shock, and human endurance. The knowledge gained from watching bodies break in controlled conditions advanced surgical techniques and bone-setting practices. Dr. Felix Platter of Basel wrote in 1596, "Observation of judicial wheel breaking has corrected several anatomical misconceptions. The relationship between bone integrity and consciousness differs from theoretical predictions. The body's capacity to maintain awareness despite massive trauma exceeds medical expectations." By 1600, the breaking wheel had evolved regional variations. German states favored striking from below, breaking bones upward. French executioners preferred downward strikes. Italian cities sometimes combined the wheel with other punishments, creating hybrid spectacles that could involve partial breaking followed by other torments. The decline of the wheel came gradually. The last recorded use in Western Europe was in 1728 in Prussia, though it persisted longer in eastern regions. Its abandonment reflected not humanitarian progress, but changing concepts of justice. The Enlightenment favored quick, efficient executions over extended spectacles. The wheel, despite its engineering sophistication, belonged to an older world that was passing. If the wheel broke bodies in full public view, another Renaissance innovation made punishment invisible, hiding suffering beneath the surface of ordinary rivers and lakes. Water has always been an instrument of execution, but the Renaissance transformed drowning into a precise, repeatable, and symbolically rich form of punishment through the invention of specialized drowning cages. These devices appeared across Germany, Italy, and the Low Countries in the early 1500s, representing a convergence of metallurgy, engineering, and judicial philosophy. The cages themselves were masterpieces of ironwork. Unlike simple weights that would ensure quick drowning, these structures were designed to control the process completely. Bars were spaced to allow water flow while preventing escape. Mechanisms allowed for raising and lowering at controlled speeds. Some included platforms that could be adjusted to keep victims at specific water depths. Nuremberg's civic records from 1520 detail the commissioning of drowning cages from master metalworker Hans Grunwald. The specifications required cages that could hold 2 people, presumably couples convicted of adultery, forcing them to watch each other drown. The city paid extra for mechanisms that allowed guards to raise and lower the cages without approaching the water's edge, a safety feature that reveals practical Renaissance thinking. Grunwald's workshop records, preserved in the Metalworkers Guild archives, show the complexity of construction. Each cage required over 200 pounds of iron, 60 hours of labor, and specialized techniques for underwater corrosion resistance. The hinges alone involved 17 separate parts to ensure smooth operation when submerged. This wasn't simple metalwork, but precision engineering designed for aquatic function. The location of drownings was carefully chosen. Not random rivers, but specific sites with symbolic significance. Adulterers might be drowned where rivers joined, representing the inappropriate joining of bodies. Thieves faced drowning where rivers passed market districts, their punishment visible to the merchants they had wronged. Venice developed perhaps the most sophisticated drowning infrastructure. The city's unique aquatic geography allowed for permanent drowning stations at specific bridges. Pulleys and winches were built into bridge architecture, allowing operators to control multiple cages simultaneously. The Bridge of Sighs gained its name partly from its proximity to these drowning mechanisms, where victims' final breaths created the eponymous sounds. In 1543, Augsburg used drowning cages for 3 women accused of infanticide. The execution was scheduled for dawn, with city bells summoning witnesses. The women were lowered simultaneously, but at different speeds, creating a hierarchy of suffering that reflected their perceived levels of guilt. The last to drown had to watch the others die first, a psychological torture that preceded physical death. The City Chronicle records, "The first expired after 7 minutes, the second after 12. The third was raised and lowered thrice before final submersion, lasting 23 minutes in total." The crowd remained silent throughout, as mandated by civic decree. This clinical description reveals how drowning became bureaucratized performance. The engineering evolved to allow for repeated immersion. Guards could lower victims until they lost consciousness, raise them for revival, then lower them again. This cycling could continue for hours, creating a prolonged execution that demonstrated authorities' complete control over life and death. Italian cities particularly favored this method, with Venice using specialized cages in the lagoon that could be operated by pulley systems from bridges. Winter drownings added another dimension. In German states, holes were cut in frozen rivers for cage drownings, combining freezing with drowning. The shock of cold water would cause involuntary gasping, accelerating water inhalation. Bodies retrieved from winter drownings showed distinctive preservation that Renaissance physicians documented with scientific interest. Dr. Heinrich Stromer of Nuremberg wrote in 1558, The winter drowning produces unique corpse characteristics. Rapid cooling prevents normal putrefaction. Muscle rigidity occurs differently than in warm water drowning. These observations suggest applications for preserving anatomical specimens. His medical interest in execution consequences shows how punishment served scientific advancement. The cages weren't just functional, but often decorated. Some featured religious imagery, suggesting divine approval of the punishment. Others bore civic crests, marking them as instruments of legitimate authority. The decoration served practical purposes, too, making the cages visible from greater distances and harder for accomplices to claim they hadn't seen the drowning in progress. Frankfurt's cage, preserved in the City Museum, shows elaborate metalwork, including Latin inscriptions about justice, decorative scrollwork, and a mechanism for attaching identification plaques describing the victim's crimes. This wasn't just an execution device, but a statement of civic values rendered in iron. By 1580, most cities had established protocols for cage drowning. The time of day required witnesses. Even the prayers to be said were standardized. This bureaucratization of drowning transformed it from passionate revenge into administrative procedure. Clerks recorded water temperature, immersion times, and victim responses with the same detachment they used for tax records. The Frankfurt Protocol of 1582 specifies, quote, drowning to commence at first bell after sunrise. Minimum 3 council members present. Quote, scribe to record time of submersion and expiration. Physician to confirm death before removal. Body to remain displayed until sunset, unless weather requires earlier retrieval. The end of widespread cage drowning came in the early 1600s, largely due to practical rather than humanitarian concerns. The cages were expensive to maintain, required specialized operators, and occasionally malfunctioned in public. Cities found that simpler executions achieved the same deterrent effect without the complex logistics of drowning cages. But if drowning cages erased people beneath water's surface, the next punishment took erasure to its logical extreme, dividing bodies into fragments scattered across entire regions. The Renaissance inherited the concept of quartering from medieval times, but transformed it into a precisely orchestrated destruction that combined anatomical knowledge, mechanical innovation, and theatrical spectacle. This wasn't mere dismemberment, but a calculated deconstruction of the human form that could take hours to complete. The most famous case occurred in Paris on May 27, 1610. François Ravaillac, who had assassinated King Henry IV, faced a quartering so elaborate that it required a written protocol of 43 steps. The entire procedure was planned like a Renaissance theatrical production, with specific timing, positioning, and even crowd management strategies. The protocol, preserved in the Archives Nationales, reads like a theater director's prompt book. Hour 1, arrival and positioning on scaffold. Hour 2, application of preliminary torments. Hour 3, attachment to horses. Hour 4 through 6, the drawing. Hour 7, final division and display preparation. Each phase had substeps, contingencies, and assigned personnel. The French method employed horses, 4 specially trained animals that would pull in perpendicular directions. But this wasn't simple attachment and pulling. Renaissance engineers had developed harnesses that distributed force gradually, preventing immediate dismemberment. The goal was extension, then separation, with consciousness maintained as long as possible. The horse trainer Philippe Marchand was paid 100 livres to prepare the animals for Ravaillac's execution. His receipt specifies training of 4 horses in synchronized pulling, resistance to crowd noise, and maintenance of steady tension without sudden acceleration. The horses became performers in this carefully orchestrated destruction. Contemporary accounts describe how Ravaillac's joints had to be cut partially before the horses could complete the separation. This wasn't failure, but design. The executioner made precise incisions that weakened connections without severing them, allowing the horses to complete the visible break. The crowd saw divine justice through equine power, not knowing human hands had enabled it. The executioner, Charles Henri Sanson, ancestor of the famous revolutionary executioner, left notes describing the technique. The shoulder joints require cuts of 1-inch depth at specific angles. The hip joints resist more, requiring deeper incisions. The key is weakening without visible severing, maintaining the illusion of horses alone achieving justice. English quartering followed different principles. The victim was first hanged to near death, then cut down while still conscious. The disemboweling that followed was performed with surgical precision, organs removed in specific order that Renaissance anatomists had determined would maintain awareness longest. Only after complete evisceration would the body be divided into quarters. The English method was codified in legal texts with medical precision. Sir Edward Coke's Institutes of the Laws of England specifies, "The traitor shall be drawn to the place of execution, hanged by the neck until half dead, disemboweled while yet living, his privy parts cut off, his entrails burned before his face, his head severed, his body quartered." Each step had legal and medical significance. The distribution of parts followed careful planning. Each quarter would be sent to different locations, chosen for maximum symbolic impact. City gates, bridges, crossroads, places where the fragments would be seen by specific populations. This geographic scattering required logistics that Renaissance administrators documented meticulously. London's Tower records from 1594 detail the distribution of quarters from the execution of Rodrigo Lopez. Right arm with shoulder to London Bridge, left arm to Westminster, right leg to Southwark, left leg to Tower Hill, head to remain on bridge until corruption requires removal. The bureaucracy of dismemberment required careful coordination. In 1594, the execution of Rodrigo Lopez, physician to Queen Elizabeth, demonstrated the English refinement of the process. Witnesses noted that he remained conscious through the hanging and into the disemboweling phase, attempting to speak even as organs were removed. The precision required to achieve this prolonged awareness reveals deep anatomical knowledge applied to destructive purposes. German states added their own innovations. Some regions used mechanical devices, essentially windlasses that would slowly pull limbs apart with measured force. The operator could control the speed of separation with mathematical precision, turning handles that advanced screws by exact increments. These machines still exist in museums, their gears and pulleys testament to Renaissance engineering applied to human destruction. The Rothenburg Torture Museum displays a quartering machine from 1580 with an engineer's plate indicating its creator. Constructed by Master Hans Daubmann, mechanician, Anno Domini 1580. The same craftsmen who built clocks and mill machinery applied their skills to human dismemberment. The audience for quarterings was carefully managed. Viewing platforms were constructed with sight lines calculated to show different aspects to different social classes. Nobles watched from elevated positions that provided overview without gore. Common people stood closer, experiencing the visceral reality. This architectural hierarchy reinforced social order even during the disorder of execution. By 1650, quartering had become rare except for the most heinous crimes. The spectacle had become too extreme for increasingly refined sensibilities. The Renaissance was giving way to early modern period, and public taste was shifting from extended suffering to efficient justice. And yet, even quartering retained the body's basic form, however divided. The final punishment we'll examine went further, attempting to remove the very surface of humanity itself. The Renaissance period's ultimate expression of punishment as art was Flaying, the methodical removal of skin that transformed human beings into anatomical displays. This punishment, while rare, occurred enough to be documented in legal codes and medical texts across Europe, particularly in Italy and the borderlands with the Ottoman Empire. In 1526, during the Italian Wars, a group of mercenaries who had betrayed their contract were sentenced to flaying in Milan. The execution was performed by a surgeon, not an executioner, highlighting the Renaissance fusion of medical knowledge with judicial punishment. The procedure required understanding of skin attachment points, blood vessel locations, and pain management, not to minimize suffering, but to extend it. The surgeon, identified in records as Master Pietro Diabano, was paid 50 ducats for his services, more than most physicians earned in a year. His selection wasn't random. He had written treatises on anatomy and was considered an expert in what he called the architecture of the human covering. His approach to flaying was methodical, almost academic. The process began at extremities, fingers and toes, where skin could be loosened and pulled like removing gloves. Renaissance anatomists had identified that starting at these points allowed for gradual progression while maintaining consciousness. The skin would be cut in specific patterns that facilitated removal in large sheets rather than strips, preserving it for later display. Diabano's notes, discovered in the Bibliotheca Ambrosiana, describe his technique. Begin with circumferential incisions at wrists and ankles. Create longitudinal relief cuts along natural tension lines. The facial skin requires particular care to preserve features for later identification. Work proceeds in sections, allowing recovery between phases to prevent shock-induced unconsciousness. What distinguished Renaissance flaying from ancient practices was the systematic documentation. Observers recorded which areas caused most distress, how long consciousness persisted, what techniques preserved skin integrity for display. This wasn't random brutality, but studied procedure that contributed to anatomical texts of the period. The preserved skins served as warnings more powerful than any written proclamation. In Perugia, the flayed skin of a rebel leader was tanned and displayed at the city gates for 3 years. The preservation process itself became specialized, with tanners developing methods specifically for human skin that would maintain flexibility and color longer than traditional techniques. The Tanners Guild of Perugia records the recipe. Human skin requires gentler processing than animal hide. Use oak bark tannins at half strength. Add rosemary and sage oils to prevent insect damage. Stretch on specially constructed frames that maintain anatomical proportions. The face must be stuffed with sawdust to maintain features. This technical precision transformed human remains into durable warnings. The symbolic aspects were carefully considered. Removing skin literally removed the barrier between internal and external, exposing the humanity beneath, while paradoxically dehumanizing completely. Renaissance philosophy dealt extensively with surfaces and essences, and flaying became a grotesque literalization of revealing inner truth. Marsilio Ficino, the Renaissance philosopher, wrote about witnessing a flaying in Florence. What is man without his covering? The skin defines our boundary with the world. To remove it is to dissolve the distinction between self and other, between human and meat. The punishment doesn't just kill, it uncreates the person. Medical professionals who attended flayings contributed observations to anatomical knowledge. Andrea Vesalius, the famous anatomist, referenced judicial flayings in his work, noting how they revealed muscle structure and attachment points difficult to observe in normal dissection. This knowledge, gained through judicial torture, advanced Renaissance understanding of human physiology. Vesalius wrote to a colleague in 1543, "The judicial flaying I observed in Padua revealed the fascial planes more clearly than any dissection. The living tissue's response to separation differs markedly from the dead. These observations have corrected several errors in Galen's muscular descriptions." The rarity of flaying made it more powerful as threat than practice. Most Renaissance cities had laws permitting it for specific crimes, particularly treason and sacrilege, but actual implementation required extraordinary circumstances. The possibility of flaying, the knowledge that authority could literally remove one's surface, created psychological control beyond its actual use. By the late 1500s, flaying had largely disappeared from European practice, persisting mainly in border regions, where it served as response to equally extreme punishments from enemy forces. The Renaissance was developing new concepts of bodily integrity that made flaying seem barbaric even to societies that still practiced quartering and breaking. The last documented judicial flaying in Western Europe occurred in 1598 in Hungary, though unofficial instances likely continued in military contexts. The formal abandonment of flaying marked a transition in punishment philosophy, from destroying bodies to controlling minds, from physical obliteration to social elimination. We return to that chamber beneath Florence's Palazzo Vecchio. The stones are worn smooth now by tourist feet, the iron fixtures removed to museums where they're displayed behind glass with small plaques explaining their function in language carefully chosen not to disturb. But Caterina, whose name opened our journey into Renaissance punishment, remains suspended in that moment when brilliant creativity turned toward human destruction. She represents thousands whose suffering funded the same civilization we celebrate for its art and learning. The hands that painted ceilings and carved marble also built wheels, racks, and cages. The minds that mapped the heavens also calculated exactly how much pressure human joints could withstand. The Renaissance did not simply create beauty, it created horror with equal innovation. What we've examined today reveals an uncomfortable truth about human progress. The same intellectual awakening that gave us perspective in painting gave us perspective in punishment. The mathematical principles that created perfect architectural proportions were applied to calculating perfect suffering. The anatomical knowledge that produced masterful sculptures also identified the body's most vulnerable points. Consider the workshops where these devices were made. In Florence, the Via dei Serragli housed both Benvenuto Cellini's artistic studio and workshops producing execution equipment. Craftsmen moved between assignments without distinction. Morning might bring work on a silver chalice for the cathedral. Afternoon, adjustments to a breaking wheel's iron reinforcements. The same attention to detail, the same pride in craft, applied equally to both. Each device we've explored represents a different facet of Renaissance innovation applied to destruction. The Scavenger's Daughter showed mechanical precision overwhelming human resistance. The sawing punishment demonstrated theatrical staging of justice. The branks revealed how technology could attack identity itself. The pair of anguish embodied controlled expansion applied to the body's spaces. The breaking wheel combined engineering with extended spectacle. Drowning cages merged metallurgy with measured suffocation. Quartering scattered bodies across geography with calculated symbolism. Flaying removed the very surface of humanity with surgical precision. These weren't the products of barbarism, but of civilization at its most confident. The Renaissance believed human reason could perfect everything, including the destruction of humans who violated reason's order. The same systematic thinking that categorized plants and mapped stars categorized crimes and mapped suffering. The intellectual framework supporting these punishments was sophisticated. Legal scholars wrote treatises on the proper application of torture, citing classical authorities and contemporary medical knowledge. University lectures included discussions of punishment theory alongside rhetoric and philosophy. This wasn't hidden knowledge, but part of mainstream Renaissance education. Modern museums display these devices as curiosities, artifacts of a less enlightened time. But they're actually monuments to what happens when human creativity serves power without moral constraint. The Renaissance torture devices weren't failures of civilization, but expressions of it, showing what refined cultures can create when they turn their refinement toward refined cruelty. The transformation of torture chambers into tourist sites represents our own attempt to distance ourselves from this history. The London Dungeon, the Medieval Crime Museum in Rothenburg, the Torture Museum in Amsterdam, all present Renaissance punishment as entertainment, safely contained behind glass and explained with historical context that makes it seem impossibly remote from our own time. But distance is impossible when the same creativity that produced these horrors produced the art we still admire. The Sistine Chapel and the Scavenger's Daughter emerged from the same cultural moment. Leonardo da Vinci sketched both flying machines and execution devices. The Renaissance mind saw no contradiction between creating beauty and perfecting suffering. Leonardo's notebooks, in fact, contain designs for an improved rack that would apply pressure more evenly across joints, preventing premature unconsciousness. Next to these sketches are studies for the Mona Lisa's hands. The same analytical eye that captured human beauty also calculated human breaking points. This duality challenges our comfortable narrative of progress. We want to believe that artistic achievement and human cruelty exist in separate spheres, that cultures that produce great art must be fundamentally humane. The Renaissance proves otherwise. It shows that human creativity is morally neutral, as capable of designing torture devices as telescopes. The real horror of Renaissance punishment isn't the physical suffering it caused, but what it reveals about human nature. Given sufficient intelligence, resources, and authority, humans will innovate suffering as readily as anything else. The same drive that pushes us to solve problems, to improve techniques, to perfect methods, can be aimed at perfecting pain. Every Renaissance punishment device was an improvement on what came before, more precise, more controlled, more effective. The evolution from medieval brutality to Renaissance refinement wasn't humanitarian progress, but technical advancement. They didn't become less cruel. They became more efficiently cruel. The documentation systems developed for punishment influenced modern bureaucracy. The careful recording of torture sessions, the standardized forms for execution orders, the detailed inventories of punishment devices, all contributed to the administrative structures we still use today. Our modern states inherited not just Renaissance art and science, but also its systematic approach to human control. The witnesses to these punishments weren't barbarians, but citizens of the most advanced civilization of their time. They attended executions after viewing art exhibitions, discussed quartering techniques over wine from precisely cultivated vineyards. They saw no contradiction between appreciating human achievement and watching humans be methodically destroyed. A Venetian merchant's diary from 1578 captures this duality. Morning. Purchased new Titian painting for eastern wall of villa. Afternoon. Attended quartering of trader in Piazza San Marco. Excellent view from Procurity balcony. Evening. Dinner with guild members. Discussed both events with equal enthusiasm. This historical mirror reflects uncomfortable truths about our own time. We, too, combine remarkable creativity with systematic cruelty, though our methods have evolved. We, too, innovate suffering while celebrating innovation. We, too, normalize horrors that future generations will struggle to comprehend. The Renaissance torture devices remind us that progress isn't moral but technical, that civilizations advance in all directions simultaneously, including toward more sophisticated suffering, that the same species capable of painting the Mona Lisa is capable of designing the Scavenger's Daughter. In the end, the most horrific Renaissance punishment might not be any single device or method, but the transformation of punishment itself into a science. The reduction of human suffering to principles and procedures, innovations and improvements. The application of humanity's greatest gift, our creativity, to the destruction of humanity itself. Today's criminal justice systems pride themselves on being humane, but they're direct descendants of Renaissance innovations in systematic punishment. The careful documentation, the precise procedures, the calculated degrees of suffering, all originated in the same chambers where Renaissance justice transformed torture into technique. When we admire Renaissance achievements, we must remember their full scope. Yes, they gave us artistic perspective, scientific method, global exploration, and classical learning's rebirth. But they also gave us systematic torture, calculated cruelty, and the transformation of punishment into performance. The iron devices are museum pieces now. The breaking wheels have stopped turning. The drowning cages have rusted away. But the Renaissance innovation they represent, the application of human brilliance to human suffering, continues in new forms. Different methods, same creativity. Different targets, same precision. The shadows of the Renaissance still haunt us, not in the devices themselves, but in the thinking that created them. The belief that reason can perfect even unreasonable cruelty. That intelligence applied to suffering is still intelligence. That innovation in destruction is still innovation. We comfort ourselves by believing we've evolved beyond such horrors. But the Renaissance thought the same about medieval barbarism, even as they perfected it. Each age believes itself more humane than the last, while finding new ways to apply human ingenuity to human suffering. Centuries later, those shadows remind us that human creativity is a tool, not a virtue, that the same minds capable of imagining paradise are capable of engineering hell, that the Renaissance, for all its light, cast very dark shadows indeed. And in those shadows, Katerina and thousands like her paid the price for living when human creativity turned toward human destruction. Their names are mostly lost, their suffering reduced to entries in execution ledgers, their humanity sacrificed to the Renaissance belief that reason could perfect even cruelty. They deserved better from an age that called itself enlightened. We all do. The chambers beneath the Palazzo Vecchio are tourist attractions now, their terrible purpose sanitized into historical curiosity. But if you listen carefully in those stone rooms, you might still hear echoes of Renaissance innovation's darkest achievements, reminders that human brilliance, without human compassion, creates monuments to suffering that outlast even monuments to beauty. The Renaissance gave us unprecedented achievements in art, science, and human understanding. But it also showed us what happens when that same innovative spirit is applied to human destruction. That lesson, written in iron and blood across 3 centuries of European history, remains the Renaissance's darkest and most important legacy.